Staring at my billionaire landlord in the hallway, I knew a midnight knock meant absolute ruin. Victoria Sterling came to evict me and my sick daughter over a noise complaint. I braced myself to lose everything. But the next morning, in her sterile office, she slid a new contract across the desk. It wasn't an eviction notice. She offered to cut my rent in half in exchange for something completely off the books. The rain in Seattle didn't just fall. It felt like a deliberate, heavy assault on the thin glass of my third-floor window. I sat on the edge of the worn mattress, gently holding the plastic nebulizer mask over my 4-year-old daughter's face. "Just a few more minutes, Bug," I whispered, using my thumb to brush a stray, damp curl from Lily's forehead. "We've got this." The machine hummed a low, mechanical rhythm, vibrating against the old wooden nightstand as it pumped vaporized medicine into her lungs. Outside, the autumn wind howled through the steep streets of Queen Anne, rattling the vintage bones of the apartment building I called home. Then, cutting straight through the white noise of the storm and the machine, came a sharp, rhythmic knock at my front door. 3 precise, unhurried raps. I froze, my eyes instantly darting to the digital clock on the kitchen counter, which blinked a hostile 11:42 p.m. In this building, a midnight knock never meant a friendly neighbor. It meant trouble. Or worse, the woman who owned the deed to my life. I carefully handed the plastic mask to Lily, ensuring her small hands held it straight, before standing up and smoothing down my faded denim jacket. When I pulled the heavy oak door open, the dim hallway light framed a figure that looked entirely out of place in a midnight storm. Victoria Sterling stood there like a tailored statue, completely impervious to the elements raging outside the building. Her signature blonde bob was perfectly intact, and her deep, charcoal gray suit looked as crisp as if it were 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. "Good evening, Miss Vance," Victoria said, her voice a low, measured baritone that instantly cut through the humid air of my small apartment. She didn't wait for an invitation to speak, nor did she step across the threshold, maintaining a rigid, calculated distance that felt miles wide. "Let me be clear," she continued, her ice-blue eyes locking onto mine with the absolute weight of a courtroom judge. "Your lease explicitly states a zero-tolerance policy for ambient noise after 10 o'clock. I felt a familiar, cold tightness grip my throat, the weight of my precarious financial survival suddenly crashing down on my chest. "It's my daughter's medical equipment, Miss Sterling," I explained, my words tumbling out much faster than her slow, deliberate cadence. "She has a severe seasonal asthma flare-up, and the humidity tonight is making it impossible for her to breathe without it." Victoria didn't blink, her gaze remaining entirely unreadable as she looked past my shoulder, scanning the small, cluttered living room. The subtle scent of cedarwood and high-end cold brew drifted off her, momentarily masking the sharp, clinical smell of the nebulizer medicine. "The tenant directly below you contacted management 20 minutes ago regarding a continuous, low-frequency vibration," Victoria stated calmly. She raised a slim leather folder she held in her left hand, her long, manicured fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic beat against the cover. "A lease is a binding contract designed to ensure the comfort of all residents, not a set of flexible guidelines to be altered by circumstance." My protective maternal instincts, usually buried under layers of bone-deep exhaustion, spiked into something fierce and fought. "She is 4 years old, and she is trying to breathe," I said, shifting my weight to physically block her view of our tiny home. "I'm not going to turn off a machine that keeps my daughter out of the emergency room just to satisfy a noise clause." Victoria's eyes snapped back to mine, the icy blue darkening slightly as she processed the sudden defiance in my voice. For a fraction of a second, the persistent mechanical tapping of her fingernails against the leather folder stopped completely. "I am fully aware of your daughter's aids, Miss Vance," Victoria said, her tone dropping an octave, becoming even quieter and more measured. "However, successful property management relies entirely on uniform enforcement, not emotional exceptions." Before I could fire back another desperate argument, a soft, shuffling sound came from behind the living room sofa.
Lily stood there in her oversized flannel pajamas, clutching her ragged stuffed bear against her chest, her big hazel eyes wide and glassy. "Mommy?" Lily wheezed softly, her small feet bare against the cold hardwood floor. "Is the pretty lady mad at us because I'm coughing?" Victoria's gaze shifted instantly from my face down to the little girl standing in the middle of the room. The rigid, corporate composure didn't vanish from the landlord's face, but I noticed a slight, almost imperceptible tightening around the corners of her sharp jawline.
"Go back to the bedroom, Bug," I said softly, keeping my voice gentle despite the storm of anxiety raging inside me. "Everything is fine, I promise." Instead of retreating, Lily took 3 wobbly steps forward, stopping right at my side and staring up at the towering woman in the tailored suit. With a completely unbothered innocence, Lily extended her small, crayon-stained hand, holding up a wrinkled piece of drawing paper. "I drew the moon before the machine started," Lily whispered, offering the paper upward into the cold space between us. "It looks just like your eyes when the big building lights shine on them." I braced myself for the cold, dismissive rejection that would inevitably crush my daughter's sensitive spirit. Victoria looked down at the crude sketch, which featured a sharp, lopsided blue crescent surrounded by chaotic swirls of bright yellow crayon. Her gloved hand hovered in the air for a long moment before she took the paper, holding it by the absolute edge as if it were a fragile artifact. "Your composition lacks any sense of traditional structure," Victoria murmured, her voice flat, though her eyes lingered on the wax colors for a beat too long. "However, your color accuracy is surprisingly precise." She carefully slid the drawing inside her expensive leather folder, closing it with a definitive snap before looking back up at me. "I will grant a temporary variance for the medical equipment for the remainder of the night," Victoria announced, her corporate mask firmly back in place. "However, tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock, you will report to my main office on the ground floor." She stepped back into the shadows of the dimly lit corridor, the cold air of the hallway rushing into my apartment as she retreated. "We will renegotiate the terms of your tenancy," she added, her eyes locking onto mine one last time. "Or you will need to find a residence more suited to your dynamic lifestyle." Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and walked down the hallway, the sharp click of her stiletto boots echoing perfectly in the quiet night. I closed the door and leaned my back against the heavy wood, letting out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for months. The harsh reality of our situation pressed heavily against me. The Queen Anne neighborhood was gentrifying rapidly, and my savings were practically non-existent. Between Lily's ongoing medical bills and my irregular income as a freelance illustrator, finding another apartment in Seattle would be an absolute impossibility. "Is the Ice Queen going to melt our castle, Mommy?" Lily asked, looking up at me with total, unshakable trust. I knelt down, wrapping my arms around her small shoulders and breathing in the comforting, familiar scent of her baby shampoo. "No way, Bug," I lied smoothly, pressing a warm kiss into her messy hair. "We've got this, remember?" The following morning, the violent storm had dissolved into a thick, melancholic gray mist that completely shrouded the Seattle skyline. I dressed in my best silk blouse, though I kept my reliable, ink-stained denim jacket on over it, treating the worn fabric like a suit of armor. The ground floor leasing office was a masterpiece of intimidating modern minimalism. Polished concrete floors, towering glass panes, and stark white walls. Victoria sat behind a massive, dark walnut desk that looked entirely devoid of personal touches or human clutter. She was typing rapidly on a sleek laptop, the rhythmic click of her keys sounding like a tiny, aggressive march in the silent room.
She didn't look up when the heavy glass door clicked shut behind me, merely gesturing with a slight nod toward the leather chair opposite her. "Sit, Miss Vance," she said, her voice completely devoid of the late-night fatigue most people would feel after a storm. I sat down, gripping the straps of my canvas tote bag so tightly that my knuckles turned a dull, bloodless white. "Look, Miss Sterling," I began, determined to take the initiative before she could deliver a formal eviction notice. "I've already figured out a solution. I can move the nebulizer into the hallway closet, which will soundproof the vibration completely." "Let me be clear," Victoria interrupted, closing her laptop with a soft, authoritative snap that cut me off mid-sentence. She laced her long fingers together on the desk, her ice-blue eyes fixing onto me with an intensity that made the modern office feel incredibly small. "I have spent the morning reviewing your complete financial history and your original lease application from last year." She slid a neatly printed stack of bank statements and credit reports across the polished walnut surface toward me. "Your income from freelance illustration and your part-time hours at the bookstore is highly erratic," she stated bluntly. "By every standard risk assessment metric used by this firm, you are currently considered an unstable tenant." The unvarnished truth hit me like a physical blow, leaving a bitter, metallic taste of panic in the back of my mouth. "I have never missed a single rent payment, and you know it," I countered, leaning forward and refusing to let her see me tremble. "True," Victoria conceded, her index finger beginning that slow, maddening tap against the edge of the dark wood. "But you are cutting it dangerously close to zero every single month, leaving no margin for unexpected medical expenses." She opened a secondary manila folder, revealing a fresh lease document with several long paragraphs highlighted in bright yellow ink. "I have drafted a highly specific addendum to your contract," she said, pushing the document directly into my personal space. "It will allow you to remain in the apartment legally, provided you agree to a non-traditional exchange of services." I picked up the heavy paper, my eyes scanning the dense legal terminology until they landed on the highlighted section near the bottom. My breath hitched in my throat, my mind struggling to process the bizarre sentence printed clearly in black ink. The clause did not demand a higher security deposit, an increased monthly rent payment, or stricter quiet hours. Instead, it explicitly required me to provide 3 hours of private structured art tutoring per week to a designated client, in exchange for a 50% reduction in my monthly rent. I stared at the paper for a long time, then slowly lifted my head to look at the entirely unreadable face of the woman sitting across from me. "A 50% reduction is thousands of dollars over the year," I whispered, my voice shaking slightly. "Who is the client that warrants this kind of corporate charity?" Victoria leaned back slightly in her leather executive chair, a fleeting shadow of something deeply hidden crossing her icy eyes. "Me," she said simply. I stared at the woman across the desk, waiting for the punchline. But Victoria Sterling did not do punchlines. Her face remained as still and unreadable as a marble monument. "You," I repeated, the word sounding small and ridiculous in the vast, minimalist office. "You want me to teach you how to draw." Victoria leaned forward slightly, resting her forearms on the dark walnut desk, the silver links of her watch catching the pale morning light. "Let me be clear, Ms. Vance," she said, her voice dropping into that slow, authoritative baritone. "I do not waste my money, nor do I waste my time." She tapped her manicured index finger against the fresh lease addendum, the sound sharp and rhythmic. "My position requires an immense amount of analytical rigidity, and my corporate advisor has strongly suggested a creative outlet to mitigate executive burnout." I let out a short, dry laugh before I could stop myself, shifting my weight in the heavy leather chair. "So, instead of taking up yoga or buying a sports car, you decided to cut a single mother's rent in half." Victoria's ice-blue eyes narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter, a subtle shift that sent a sudden spike of caution down my spine. I am offering you a mutually beneficial transaction, she stated coldly, ignoring my sarcasm entirely. You possess a master's degree in fine arts and an evident talent, while I possess the deed to your apartment and a need for instruction. She slid a sleek, heavy, matte black pen across the polished wood, the metal rolling silently until it tapped against my knuckles. You can sign the addendum and secure your daughter's home for the next 12 months, or you can begin packing your boxes. I looked down at the pen, then at the contract. The highlighted yellow lines blurred slightly by the sheer weight of my exhaustion. I thought of Lily's small bare feet on the cold hardwood floor from the night before, and the raspy, terrifying sound of her struggling to breathe. I didn't have the luxury of pride. I didn't have the option to walk away from a miracle, even if that miracle came wrapped in a terrifying corporate suit. I picked up the pen, its weight surprisingly heavy in my hand, and firmly signed my name on the dotted line. 3 hours a week, I said, looking up to move her icy glare as I pushed the paper back across the desk. But I don't censor my teaching style, Miss Sterling, and art isn't something you can manage with a spreadsheet. Victoria picked up the document, checking the signature with a clinical eye before sliding it back into the manila folder. Our first session will be this Saturday at 7 in the evening, she said, closing the folding with a definitive, satisfying snap. Do not be late, Ms. Vance. The elevator doors slid open directly into a space that felt less like a home and more like a high-end modern art gallery.
Victoria's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the building, surrounded by massive floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a rain-slicked Elliott Bay. The floors were polished white concrete, reflecting the distant, twinkling amber lights of the Seattle shipping docks far below. The air inside was cool, carrying that same familiar, intoxicating scent of rich cedar wood and expensive, clean linen. I stood in the entryway, clutching a heavy canvas bag filled with charcoal sticks, rough sketching paper, and various blending stumps. "In here, Ms. Vance," Victoria's voice called out from the expansive living area, echoing slightly against the bare white walls. I walked toward the sound, my worn canvas sneakers squeaking softly against the pristine concrete floor. Victoria was standing by a massive kitchen island, pouring dark liquid from a minimalist glass carafe into 2 heavy crystal tumblers. She had abandoned her rigid corporate armor, wearing a soft cream-colored silk blouse with the top 2 buttons undone and tailored black trousers. Her golden, shoulder-length hair was slightly loose, a few stray strands framing the sharp, elegant angle of her jawline. "I took the liberty of purchasing the easel you requested," she said, gesturing toward a pristine, expensive mahogany tripod standing in the center of the room. She walked toward me, extending one of the crystal glasses, the ice cubes clinking softly against the heavy glass. "Black coffee, cold brew?" she murmured, her eyes scanning my face with a quiet intensity. "I assume you prefer it without sugar, given your frequent visits to the cafe down the street." I froze for a second, surprised by the realization that she had actually noticed my daily mundane routine. "Thank you," I said, taking the glass, our fingers brushing for a brief, fleeting moment that felt surprisingly warm against the cool room. I quickly turned toward the easel, setting my heavy canvas bag down on the floor to break the sudden, unexpected tension. "All right, Miss Sterling," I began, pulling out a large pad of rough, textured gray drawing paper. "Let's see what we are working with. Show me how you hold a pencil." Victoria set her coffee down and stepped up to the easel, her posture instantly reverting to that rigid military straightness. She picked up a thick stick of willow charcoal, gripping it tightly between her thumb and index finger like a weapon or a legal document. "Like this," she stated, her knuckles turning slightly white from the sheer force of her grip. I couldn't help but smile, stepping closer to her until I could feel the faint, radiating warmth of her body in the open room. "You're not drafting an eviction notice, Victoria," I said, using her first name intentionally to see if her corporate mask would crack. "It's charcoal. If you squeeze it that hard, it will snap into dust." She didn't object to the use of her first name, but her jaw tightened, her ice blue eyes fixed entirely on the blank white paper. "Control is a fundamental requirement for precision," she countered, her voice low and slightly defensive. "Art isn't about control," I murmured, taking another step forward until I was standing almost directly behind her right shoulder. "It's about observation and letting your hand follow what your eyes actually see, not what your brain thinks it knows." I reached out, my ink-stained fingers gently wrapping around her cool, smooth hand, covering her tight grip with my own warm palm. Victoria stiffened instantly, her entire body locking up as her breath caught sharply in her throat. The silence in the penthouse became absolute, save for the soft, persistent patter of the Seattle rain against the massive glass windows behind us. "Loosen your fingers," I whispered, keeping my hand steady on hers, feeling the rapid, rhythmic pulse beating against her wrist. I gently guided her hand down, forcing her rigid fingers to relax until the charcoal stick rested loosely against her palm. "Now, don't look at the paper," I instructed, my voice quiet, close enough that a stray lock of my curly hair brushed against her silk shoulder. "Look at the coffee glass on the counter. Just draw the outline without taking your eyes off the object." Victoria didn't move for a long moment, her gaze locked onto the crystal glass, her breathing shallow and deliberate. Slowly, under the guidance of my hand, her arm began to move, the charcoal making a soft, scraping sound against the textured paper. The line she drew was shaky, imperfect, and completely chaotic, a beautiful, raw departure from her usual flawless perfection. I kept my hand over hers, guiding the curve, acutely aware of the intense, heavy warmth growing between our palms. When the circle completed, Victoria suddenly turned her head, her face mere inches from mine, her ice blue eyes wide and darkened with an emotion I couldn't identify. The corporate distance she maintained so fiercely had completely vanished, leaving something raw, vulnerable, and dangerously magnetic hanging in the cool air between us. "Is this what you consider instruction, Ms. Vance?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt entirely too intimate for a landlord. I didn't step back. My hand remained resting lightly over hers, the charcoal stick pressed firmly between our shared grip. "It's called breaking the foundation," I whispered back, my eyes dropping to the slight parting of her lips before snapping back to her gaze. "You can't build something new until you're willing to let the old structure crack." Victoria looked down at our joined hands, her fingers suddenly twitching, as if she were fighting the overwhelming urge to wrap her hand around mine. Before she could speak, the sharp, persistent buzz of an intercom cut through the heavy silence of the room, shattering the fragile bubble we had built. Victoria blinked, the cold corporate mask slamming back into place so fast it made my head spin as she instantly stepped away from me. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice immediately returning to its flat, professional baritone as she walked toward the wall monitor. I stood by the easel, my hands suddenly feeling freezing cold without her skin against mine, my heart hammering against my ribs. Victoria looked at the security screen, her back rigid, before she turned around to face me with an expression that made my stomach drop. "It appears," Victoria said, her voice dropping into an ominous, quiet tone, "that we have an unexpected visitor downstairs who claims to have a legal right to your apartment." The security monitor cast a harsh blue glow over Victoria's flawless profile as she stared at the screen. On the high-definition display, a man in a damp leather jacket was pacing back and forth in the building's marble lobby downstairs. My stomach dropped so violently, I felt a sudden wave of physical nausea. It was Marcus. His hair was cropped short, his shoulders hunched with the familiar, frantic energy of a man who had spent his life running from debts and creating storms. "Miss Vance," Victoria said, her voice dropping into a register so quiet it was terrifying. "You recognize this individual?" It wasn't a question. She turned her head slowly, her ice-blue eyes locking onto my face, tracking the sudden bloodless pallor of my skin.
He is Lily's biological father, I whispered, my hands gripping the edge of the dark mahogany easel so hard the wood groaned. He walked out when she was diagnosed with asthma because the medical bills were too high. I swallowed the bitter taste of panic rising in my throat, my mind racing through 100 terrifying scenarios. He must have tracked my tax filings or the bookstore registry, I muttered, my voice trembling. He only shows up when he needs money, and he always threatens to take Lily away if I don't give it to him. Victoria didn't say a word, her expression completely frozen into a mass of absolute aristocratic calm. She walked over to the modern kitchen island, picked up her heavy crystal tumbler, and took a slow, deliberate sip of her black coffee. Then, she set the glass down with a soft, authoritative click that seemed to echo through the vast, silent penthouse. "Stay here," she commanded, her gold bob swaying slightly as she turned toward the private elevator. "No," I insisted, my protective maternal instincts instantly overriding my fear as I hurried after her. "He is my mistake, Victoria. I won't let him bring his chaos into your building or anywhere near my daughter." Victoria paused just as the stainless steel elevator doors slid open, her tall frame blocking the entrance entirely. She looked down at me, her gaze scanning my frantic eyes, before her hand rose and her long, manicured fingers lightly touched my shoulder. The contact was brief, but the firm, unyielding pressure of her palm acted like a physical anchor, slowing the chaotic racing of my heart. "Let me be clear, Elena," she said, using my first name with a dangerous, quiet gravity that sent a shiver straight down my spine. "Nobody brings chaos into my property, and nobody threatens what belongs under my roof." She stepped into the elevator, and before I could protest, she held the door open, gesturing for me to follow. The ride down to the lobby was dead silent, the digital floor indicator ticking down with an agonizing rhythmic click. When the doors finally slid open, Marcus was in the middle of arguing with the elderly evening doorman, his voice loud and obnoxious.
"I have a legal right to see my kid," Marcus shouted, slamming his palm against the polished reception desk. "You can't keep a father out of—" "Mr. Boyd." Victoria's voice cut through the cavernous lobby like a precision laser, completely halting his words mid-sentence. She stepped out of the elevator first, her posture so rigid and commanding she looked like an empress inspecting a failing colony. Marcus turned around, his eyes instantly shifting from aggressive confidence to sudden, wary confusion as he took in her expensive silk blouse and tailored trousers. "Who the hell are you?" Marcus sneered, though he instinctively took a half-step backward, intimidated by her sheer height. Victoria walked toward him with a slow, measured cadence, her hands loosely clasped behind her back, her face utterly devoid of human emotion. "I am Victoria Sterling," she stated, her voice a low, terrifyingly calm baritone that filled the entire space. "I own this building. I own the management firm that controls this district, and I own the legal team currently retaining your outstanding warrants." Marcus blinked, the color rapidly draining from his weathered face as he glanced at me standing just behind her shoulder. "Elena, what is this?" he stammered, trying to regain his footing. "You think you can hide behind some rich landlord? We have a custody arrangement from—" "You have the outstanding child support debt of $14,000 in the state of Washington," Victoria interrupted, her tone flat and clinical. She didn't raise her voice, but the absolute certainty in her words carried the weight of a heavy iron gavel. "Furthermore, you entered this private facility under false pretenses and harassed my staff, which constitutes criminal trespass." She stepped closer to him, forcing Marcus to tilt his head up to meet her icy, piercing glare. "If you are not outside the perimeter of my property within 60 seconds, Victoria whispered, the threat hanging in the air like winter frost, "I will personally contact the municipal precinct captain, who happens to be a close associate of my family." She raised her left hand, her index finger beginning a slow, hypnotic tap against the side of her tailored trousers. "I will ensure the state enforces your immediate detention. and my legal team will file a permanent restraining order before the courts open on Monday morning." Marcus opened his mouth to fire back a desperate insult, but the sheer, overwhelming weight of her systemic power crushed his defiance completely. He looked at Victoria, then at me, his fists clenching in impotent, pathetic rage before he finally spat on the pristine marble floor. "You're crazy, Elena," he muttered, turning on his heel and storming toward the heavy glass exit doors. "You and your psycho landlord can go to hell." The heavy glass doors swung shut behind him, the cool night air rushing into the lobby as the silence returned, thick and suffocating. I let out a shaky, jagged breath, my knees suddenly feeling like water as the adrenaline began to drain from my system. Victoria turned around to face me, her eyes tracking my trembling hands before she turned to the stunned doorman. "Clean the floor, Arthur," she orders doubtfully, her corporate mask firmly back in place, "and ensure Mr. Boyd's photograph is distributed to every security desk on the block immediately." "Yes, Miss Sterling," the doorman replied instantly, bowing his head in profound respect. Victoria walked back toward the elevator, her heels clicking softly against the stone, and I followed her like a shadow in the dark. Instead of taking us back to the penthouse, she pressed the button for the 3rd floor, the ride up just as quiet as the ride down. When the doors opened into my dimly lit hallway, the faint, comforting hum of Lily's nebulizer could still be heard through the thick wood of my apartment door. I walked to my door, my hand shaking so violently I could barely fit the brass key into the old lock. Suddenly, Victoria's cool, smooth hand covered mine once again, taking the key from my fingers and turning it effortlessly until the lock clicked open. She didn't step into my apartment, remaining out in the shadowed corridor, her blonde hair catching the pale amber light of the hallway lamp. "He won't return," Victoria murmured, her voice losing a fraction of its corporate edge, replaced by a low, intimate resonance. "I will have a security detail stationed at the main entrance permanently." I leaned my shoulder against the doorframe, looking up at her with a profound, aching gratitude that word that couldn't possibly express. "Why are you doing this, Victoria?" I whispered, my voice cracked with exhaustion. A 50% rent reduction was one thing, but this, you didn't have to protect us like that. Victoria stepped a fraction closer, her presence completely filling my field of vision, the scent of cedarwood and rain washing over me.
She looked down at me, her ice blue eyes darkening into something fierce, possessive, and desperately hidden. "Let me be clear, Elena," she whispered, her voice dropping so low it felt like a physical touch against my skin. "I protect my investments, and right now, your survival is entirely tied to the contract we signed." She leaned in just enough that her breath brushed against my cheek, sending an electric spark straight down my spine. "Do not let outside distractions interfere with our next session," she murmured, her eyes lingering on my lips for one breathless second before she stepped back into the shadows. "Good night, Ms. Vance." She turned and walked back toward the elevator, leaving me standing in the open doorway, my heart hammering a dangerous, terrifying new rhythm against my ribs. The week following Marcus's intrusion passed in a strange, hyper-aware blur. Every time the old elevator clicked down the hall, my chest tightened. But Victoria's promised security detail remained flawless and terrifyingly efficient. Saturday evening arrived with another classic Seattle downpour, but this time, the venue for our session shifted down to the 3rd floor. Victoria had messaged me that morning, stating that she needed to personally inspect the radiator valves in my unit to ensure the humidity wasn't triggering Lily's asthma. When she stepped across my threshold at exactly 7 o'clock, she looked entirely out of place in my cramped, colorful living room. She wore a charcoal cashmere sweater with the sleeves pushed up to her elbows, yet she still carried that unyielding executive presence that made my mismatched furniture look cheap. "The air quality in here is acceptable," Victoria murmured, her ice blue eyes scanning the walls covered in Lily's chaotic Krellon sketches, "though your heating unit requires a chematical calibration." "Nice to see you too, Victoria,"
I said, a small involuntary smile tugging at my lips as I set up a portable desktop easel at the small kitchen table. Lily was already asleep in the bedroom, exhausted from a long afternoon of painting, leaving the apartment filled with the quiet hum of the rain and the scent of cinnamon tea. Victoria walked over to the kitchen table, her index finger instinctively executing that slow, rhythmic cape against the back of the wooden chair. "Let me be clear, Elena," she said, her voice dropping into that low, deliberate cadence. "I expect our focus tonight to be on advanced shading techniques, as the previous chaotic exercise lacked analytical structure." "Art isn't a board meeting," I replied softly, stepping up beside her and placing a smooth graphite pencil in her open palm. "Tonight, we are going to learn how to capture shadows, which means you have to stop looking for straight lines." I sat on the stool right next to hers, our shoulders brushing lightly through the fabric of my denim jacket and her soft sweater. The proximity in the small kitchen was intense. The lingering scent of her cedarwood perfume seemed to completely trap the humid air between us. "Hold the pencil closer to the tip for control, but let your wrist remain loose," I instructed, my voice dropping to a quiet murmur. Victoria attempted the motion, but her fingers instantly locked up, her jaw tightening as she stared at the blank white sketchpad with intense frustration. "It is mathematically illogical to expect precision from a loose wrist," she muttered, her breath coming a bit faster as she fought the charcoal. I chuckled quietly, reaching out without thinking and wrapping my hand completely over hers, just like I had done in her penthouse. Her hand froze beneath mine, her skin cool against my warm palm, her pulse instantly ticking a rapid rhythm against my fingertips. "Stop thinking, Victoria," I whispered, leaning in closer until my lips were inches from the golden line of her jaw. "Just feel where the paper resists you." I slowly guided her hand across the page, creating a soft, sweeping gradient that mimicked the deep, velvet shadows stretching across my kitchen floor. Victoria suddenly turned her head, her piercing blue eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the air feel completely heavy. Our faces were so close I could see the tiny golden flecks in her irises and the slight, breathless parting of her lips. The corporate distance she wore like armor had entirely dissolved in the warm, dim light of my kitchen, replaced by a raw, magnetic pull that terrified me. For a long, suspended second, neither of us moved. My hand remained tightly closed over hers, our shared breath cutting through the quiet room. Then, the sudden, aggressive vibration of her phone on the counter broke the spell, shattering the heavy silence like glass. Victoria blinked, the icy composure instantly returning to her face as she pulled her hand out from under mine, leaving my palms suddenly freezing cold.
"Excuse me," she said smoothly, her voice returning to its formal baritone as she glanced at the flashing screen. "I must take this. It is the corporate acquisition board." She stood up, smoothing down her trousers, and walked out onto my small, covered balcony to answer the call, closing the glass door behind her. I stayed on the stool, my heart hammering against my ribs as I watched her through the glass, her silhouette elegant against the backdrop of the dark, rainy street. As I turned back to the table to pack up the graphite sticks, my sleeve accidentally caught the edge of her heavy leather folder, sending it sliding off the smooth walnut surface. The folder hit the floor, its brass zipper popping open, scattering a neat stack of corporate documents across the faded rug. "Damn it," I muttered, quickly kneeling down to gather the papers before the damp air from the kitchen door could ruin them. My eyes skimmed the top page automatically, looking for a title to sort them, when a highlighted bold header suddenly made my entire body go rigid. Project Queen Anne. Comprehensive Divestment and High-End Redevelopment Plan. My hands began to tremble as I pulled the document closer, my eyes tearing through the dense, clinical legal jargon printed on the expensive stationery. The plan was brilliant, heartless, and entirely absolute. Sterling Assets Management was preparing to sell the entire vintage building to a luxury condo developer,
terminating all existing leases within 90 days to clear the property. I flipped to the final page, my breath catching painfully in my throat as my gaze landed on the signature line at the bottom of the document. There, stamped in clear, unyielding black ink, was the elegant, decisive signature of Victoria Sterling. She hadn't just approved the plan, she was the architect of it. The rent reduction, the security detail, the late-night protection against my ex, it wasn't a developing connection or hidden kindness. It was a temporary management strategy to keep a volatile tenant quiet until the eviction notices could be legally served. The glass door behind me slid open with a soft, smooth hiss, the cool wind from the balcony rushing back into the small room. "The board has final line of the timeline," Victoria announced, her voice completely calm and professional as she stepped back into the kitchen. I stood up slowly, the heavy document clutched tightly in my fist, my face completely pale as I turned around to face her. Victoria's eyes fell to the papers in my hand, her body freezing mid-stride as she realized exactly what I was holding. The warm, intimate atmosphere of the kitchen evaporated instantly, leaving only a cold, sharp silence that felt like a knife between us. The silence that stretched between us was no longer the heavy, magnetic warmth of a few moments ago. It was the sharp, jagged silence of a glass mirror shattering on stones. I held the corporate document out between us, the high-quality paper trembling in my ink-stained fingers like a weapon. 90 days, I whispered, my voice shaking with a dangerous mixture of shock and sudden, suffocating fury. "You signed this 2 months ago?" Victoria stood perfectly still near the balcony door, the cool, rain-damp air blowing past her tailored shoulders. The vulnerable, unmasked woman who had just relaxed her hand under mine had vanished instantly. In her place stood the partner of Sterling Assets, her face freezing over into a smooth, impenetrable sheet of Arctic ice. "Elena," she began, her voice returning to that slow, deliberate baritone that suddenly made my stomach churn. "Put the folder down." "Don't tell me what to do," I snapped, the anger finally bursting out of my chest, hot and violent. Was this the plan all along? Reduce my rent by half, play the hero in the lobby, keep the volatile single mom happy so she doesn't cause a PR nightmare when the eviction notices roll out. Victoria's ice-blue eyes narrowed by a fraction, her jaw tightening so hard I could see a small muscle twitch beneath her porcelain skin. She took a slow step forward, her hand rising in a characteristically commanding gesture, her index finger pointing directly at the paper. "Let me be clear," she stated, her cadence dropping into that slow, terrifyingly controlled rhythm. "That document is a preliminary corporate assessment drafted long before you and I renegotiated your lease terms." "But your signature is at the bottom, Victoria," I yelled, refusing to let her hide behind her pristine corpus vocabulary. "You didn't just review it, you approved it. You are tearing down the only affordable building left in this neighborhood to build luxury condos for people who don't care about anyone else." I took a step back, my spine hitting the edge of the kitchen counter, trapping me in my own small space. "My daughter has chronic asthma, and my entire life savings wouldn't cover a first month's deposit anywhere else in Queen Anne right now." Victoria stopped moving, remaining exactly 3 feet away from me, her presence still overwhelming despite the emotional chasm opening between us. Her eyes scanned my face, tracking the tears of frustration that were threatening to spill over my lower lashes. "A real estate portfolio cannot be managed based on individual domestic vulnerabilities," she said, her voice completely flat, though her fists clenched tightly at her sides. "It is a commercial reality. The structural integrity of this building is deteriorating, and the divestment strategy is completely logical." A cold, bitter laugh escaped my lips, cutting through her clinical explanation like a rusted blade. "A commercial reality," I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "That is what Lillian are to you. Just a line item on a spreadsheet that needs to be cleared out."
I threw the heavy document onto the kitchen table, right over the beautiful, raw charcoal sketch we had just created together. The graphite smudged instantly, the dark dust blurring the lines of the imperfect circle we had drawn with our joined hands. "I actually thought you were different," I whispered, the admission hurting worse than the threat of eviction itself. "I thought beneath all that expensive armor there was a human being who actually cared about protecting us." Victoria didn't flinch, but the deep blue of her eyes darkened into an expression that looked remarkably like a suppressed, agonizing pain. She raised her hand, her fingers beginning that slow, rhythmic tap against the edge of her tailored trousers, but her hand was trembling slightly. "You are allowing emotional hyperbole to distort a professional transaction, Ms. Vance," she murmured, reverting back to my last name like a shield. "I provided you a secure contract for 12 months. I will honor that contract, regardless of the corporate timeline." "And what happens on day 3? I fired back, my voice cracking under the weight of my exhaustion. "We get thrown onto the street anyway, but with a prettier bow on the box." Before she could reply, a soft, frightened whimper came from the doorway of the small bedroom. Lily stood there, her small stuffed bear clutched tightly against her chest, her hazel eyes wide with confusion and terror as she looked at our tense postures. "Mommy?" Lily whispered, a small, wet cough rattling in her throat. "Why are you yelling at the pretty lady? Is the castle broken?" The anger drained out of me instantly, replaced by a wave of protective, maternal panic. I swept down to my knees, turning my back completely on Victoria, and pulled my daughter tightly into my arms, breathing in the safety of her scent. "The castle is fine, Bug," I lied smoothly, my voice instantly softening into that gentle cadence I reserved only for her. "We're just talking about the drawing. Go back to sleep, okay? Mommy's got this." Lily looked past my shoulder at Victoria, her small brow furrowing with a child's intuitive understanding of adult heartbreak. "Did the Ice Queen melt the moon, Mommy?" she asked softly. Victoria didn't answer, but I heard the sharp, sudden intake of her breath from behind me, followed by the definitive rustle of her cashmere sweater. I stood up slowly, keeping Lily shielded behind my legs, and pointed a rigid, trembling finger toward my front door. "Get out of my apartment, Victoria," I said, my voice dead, devoid of any anger, leaving only an absolute, unyielding wall of exhaustion. Victoria stood in the center of my small kitchen, looking at the two of us, her regal posture suddenly looking incredibly isolated against the warm colors of my home. She didn't argue, she didn't offer another corporate defense, and she didn't use her signature catchphrase. She simply reached down, picked up her heavy leather folder from the table, and walked toward the door with a slow, heavy cadence. Just before she turned the brass handle, she paused, her profile framed by the dim amber light of the corridor. "The security detail will remain downstairs," she murmured, her voice so low it was almost swallowed by the sound of the rain outside. "You are safe here, Elena, for now." The door clicked shut behind her, the latch locking with a definitive, chilling sound that echoed through the quiet apartment. I walked over to the window, watching through the blurry glass as her sleek, dark luxury sedan pulled away from the curb down below, its red taillights bleeding into the thick Seattle mist. The lease was still valid, but the illusion of safety was completely gone, leaving me alone in the dark with a ticking clock. 3 weeks of absolute freezing silence followed that night in my kitchen. I entirely avoided the ground floor, taking the vintage emergency stairs every morning just to ensure I wouldn't catch a glimpse of the sharp, blonde bob behind the walnut desk. Every night after Lily went to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by open tabs on my laptop, searching for any apartment within 50 miles of Seattle that wouldn't consume my entire monthly income. The reality was a brutal, unyielding wall. The city was priced for tech executives, leaving no room for freelance illustrators with a sick child. Yet, despite the silence, Victoria's presence remained an unavoidable weight in the building. The 2 security guards stayed stationed at the front entrance like modern metal statues, and occasionally the faint scent of cedarwood lingered in the elevator after the top floor button had been pressed. Then came the third Thursday of November, bringing a massive winter storm that meteorological reports called a historic bomb cyclone. By 9 in the evening, the wind was screaming against the Queen Anne hillside, throwing branches and sheets of freezing rain against my vintage windows. Suddenly, with a loud, violent pop from the transformer on the street below, the entire building plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The digital clock died, the hum of the refrigerator ceased, and the vital, quiet rhythm of Lily's standby nebulizers stopped instantly. A cold dread seized my throat as I heard the immediate, terrifying sound of a dry, whistling gasp coming from the small bedroom. "Mommy?" Lily wheezed into the darkness, her voice thin, panicked, and suffocated. "The lights went away and my chest feels like it has rocks on it." I scrambled through the dark, my hands shaking violently as I knocked over a water glass before finding the emergency flashlight on the nightstand. The beam of light illuminated Lily sitting up in bed, her small face completely pale, her chest retrenching deeply with every agonizing effort to draw air into her lungs. I hooked up the plastic mask to the machine, frantically flicking the switch, but the mechanical hum remained dead, the batteries in the emergency unit failing to trigger the heavy compression pump. Panic, cold absolute, paralyzed my mind as I realized the old building's backup grid had completely failed. "We've got this, Bug," I lied, my voice cracking entirely as I wrapped her in a heavy wool blanket and lifted her small, struggling body into my arms. "We're going to get help." I threw the apartment door open, intending to run down the 3 flights of dark stairs to the lobby doorman, when a powerful, blinding beam of light cut through the black corridor. Standing there, drenched in rain from the open fire escape, was Victoria. She wore a heavy dark trench coat over her tailored trousers, her golden hair damp and wild, her ice-blue eyes wide with a frantic, uncharacteristic desperation I had never seen before. She didn't say a word, nor did she ask for permission. She stepped across the threshold, her gaze instantly locking onto the pale, wheezing child in my arms. "The main transformer is completely destroyed," Victoria stated, her signature baritone voice low, rapid, and tight with immense control. "The lower grid will be dead for 12 hours. She reached out, her long, manicured fingers wrapping firmly around my arm, the unyielding strength of her grip acting like a physical jolt to my frozen system. "My penthouse operates on an independent heavy-duty industrial generator," she commanded, pulling me gently but absolute into the dark hallway. "Follow me." We didn't take the elevator. Victoria led the way up the concrete emergency stairs, her flashlight cutting a path through the shadows as I carried Lily, whose breathing was becoming shallower by the second. The moment Victoria slammed the heavy security door of the penthouse shut behind us, the world changed instantly. The top floor was brightly lit, warm, and completely insulated from the howling fury of the storm raging outside the massive glass windows. Victoria immediately ushered us into her pristine, white-tiled guest suite, where a backup medical-grade compressor sat waiting on the modern dresser, clearly purchased long before tonight. Within seconds, I had the mask over Lily's face, and the powerful, steady hum of the machine began pumping a life-saving mist into her lungs. I knelt by the side of the bed for 20 agonizing minutes, my fingers knotted tightly in Lily's flannel pajamas, until her breathing finally slowed into a regular, safe rhythm, and her eyes closed in deep, exhausted sleep. The sheer force of the relief washed over me so violently I felt dizzy, my forehead resting against the edge of the mattress as I let out a long, ragged sob I couldn't suppress.
A soft, rustling sound made me look up. Victoria was standing in the doorway, her heavy trench coat gone, her white silk blouse slightly translucent from the dampness of the rain. She held 2 heavy crystal tumblers,
the rich scent of clean cedarwood and warm tea drifting off her into the quiet, sterile room. I stood up slowly, my legs trembling, and walked out into the vast, minimalist living area, closing the guest door softly behind me to protect Lily's peace. Victoria handed me a glass, her ice-blue eyes tracking every movement of my face with a quiet, burning intensity that made the air feel instantly thick. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice raw as I took the glass, my fingers intentionally brushing against her cool skin, refusing to withdraw this time. "You saved her. Victoria, again." Victoria took a slow sip of her drink, her gaze dropping to my lips for a fraction of a second before snapping back to my eyes. "Let me be clear, Elena," she murmured, her cadence dropping into that slow, dangerous rhythm that always made my heart hammer against my ribs. "I do not allow my tenants to perish due to municipal infrastructure failures." The corporate defense was so ridiculous, so inherently false given the frantic way she had broken through my door, that the last of my restraint completely evaporated. I set the heavy crystal glass down on the island counter with a loud, resonant click, stepping directly into her personal space until I could feel the radiating heat of her body. "Stop lying to me," I whispered fiercely, my hands rising automatically to grip the lapels of her damp silk blouse, forcing her to look down at me. "You didn't run down 3 flights of stairs in a bomb cyclone for a tenant, Victoria. Why are you doing this if you're just going to throw us out in 90 days? Victoria stiffened, her breath catching sharply in her throat as my ink-stained fingers tightened against the expensive fabric over her chest. For the first time since I had met her, the Ice Queen looked entirely defenseless, her shark jawline trembling slightly as she stared down into my amber eyes. "The redevelopment plan is a corporate mandate," she whispered, her voice losing every ounce of its professional baritone, replaced by a raw, breathless confession. "My board approved it before I ever saw your name on the registry." She raised her hands, her long fingers hovering over my wrists for a long, agonizing second before she finally closed them around my arms, her grip possessive and desperately tight. "But I have spent the last 3 weeks restructuring the entire asset acquisition," she admitted, her ice-blue eyes darkening into a storm of unshielded emotion. "I am buying out the board's shares of this building with my personal capital." I froze, my mind struggling to process the sheer scale of what she was saying, my chest pressing against hers as the proximity became absolute. "Why?" I breathed, the word hanging in the small warm space between our faces. "Why would you risk that much capital for a vintage building?" Victoria leaned down, her golden bob falling forward, framing our faces in a private, shadow-filled world as her breath brushed warm against my lips. "Not for the building, Elena," she whispered, her fingers tightening against my skin with a fierce, forbidden desperation that shattered the last remaining boundary between us. The confession between us, heavy and electric, stripping away the last remaining layers of corporate strategy and defensive pride. Victoria's breath was warm against my lips, a sharp contrast to the freezing rain still lashing violently at the glass behind her. I didn't step back. Instead, my fingers curled deeper into the smooth silk of her damp blouse, pulling her down to my level. "Say it again," I whispered, my voice completely lost in the small, charged space separating our faces. Victoria didn't speak, but the answer was written in the sudden, raw cracking of her usually impenetrable, icy composure. Her hands slid from my arms up to the sides of my neck, her long fingers trembling against my skin with a desperate, unyielding possessiveness. When her lips finally met mine, the kiss wasn't the measured, calculated move of a billionaire property executive. It was a collision of years of absolute isolation, meeting a warmth she could no longer control or contain. She tasted like rich, cold brew and the sharp, metallic edge of pure adrenaline, her touch firm yet remarkably fragile. I met her halfway, the heavy exhaustion of the past year melting into the desperate, forbidden rhythm of her mouth against mine. The penthouse, with all its sterile white concrete and minimalist art, completely dissolved around us in the dark. We moved blindly toward the deep velvet sofa, the heavy shadows of the room swallowing the final boundaries of landlord and tenant.
My mother has frozen my personal capital accounts pending a full internal investigation into the Queen Anne property. She let out a shallow, jagged breath, the paper slipping from her fingers and fluttering to the polished floor. "They aren't just taking the building, Elena," she murmured, her voice cracking under the weight of the disaster. "They are removing me from the firm, and the eviction notices are being served to every tenant at noon today." The ticking of the digital clock on the walnut counter sounded like an approaching firing squad. 10:14 a.m. In less than 2 hours, the corporate machinery of Sterling Assets Management would roll out the formal eviction notices, stripping 50 families of their homes. Victoria sat motionless at the kitchen island, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee she hadn't touched. The untouchable corporate titan who had terrified me for months looked suddenly smaller, her broad shoulders tense under the pristine white fabric of her shirt. Her family trust hadn't just frozen her bank accounts, they had completely severed her access to the company's servers and the building's digital systems. "They will liquidate the asset before the courts close for the weekend," Victoria whispered, her voice missing its rhythmic, authoritative cadence, replaced by a dull, hollow rhythm. "My mother does not tolerate insubordination, and she certainly does not tolerate a public scandal involving a tenant." I walked over to her, leaving Lily safely coloring in the guest room, and placed my hand firmly over Victoria's trembling fingers. The cold marble of her skin sent a sharp jolt through my palm, a stark contrast to the burning heat we had shared just hours ago. "Look at me, Victoria," I commanded, using a tone of absolute, fierce certainty I didn't know I possessed. She lifted her head, her ice-blue eyes clouded with a thick layer of defeat and unshielded vulnerability that broke my heart. "We are not packing our boxes, and you are not letting them destroy everything you built because of a parasite like Marcus," I stated firmly. Victoria let out a short, humorless laugh, her index finger twitching against the crystal glass. "Let me be clear, Elena," she murmured, her voice cracking slightly on my name. "Without capital, I am merely an employee who has been terminated. I have no legal authority to stop the eviction." "Then we don't use corporate authority," I said, my artistic mind suddenly firing with a chaotic, desperate inspiration. "We use the structure itself." I walked rapidly over to the mahogany easel, where the heavy leather folder still lay open, its scattered corporate papers covering our smudged charcoal drawing. I began tearing through the historical blueprints and zoning assessments Victoria had compiled for the redevelopment project. "When I first moved into the 3rd floor, the old doorman told me this building survived the Great Queen Anne fire of the early 1900s. I explained, my words tumbling out in a fast, determined rush. Victoria watched me, her brow furrowing slightly as the clinical, analytical light in her eyes began to flicker back to life. "The structural integrity is irrelevant if the board owns the land title," she stated, though she stood up and walked toward the island counter. "It's not the structure, it's the heritage," I countered, pulling out a faded, yellowed page from a historical survey buried at the very bottom of the file. My ink-stained finger traced a highlighted paragraph written in dense, archaic legal script from 1912. The original architect of the building wasn't a corporate firm. It was Eleanor Sterling, Victoria's great-grandmother, who had established it as a cooperative sanctuary for working women and single mothers during the early suffrage movement. Hidden deep within the original deed was a protective municipal covenant, explicitly stating the property could never be demolished or converted for purely commercial profit, as long as it housed dependents of the community. Victoria looked down at the document, her breath catching sharply in her throat as her eyes tore through the ancient legal clauses. For a long, suspended second, the silence in the penthouse was absolute, save for the low hum of the city breathing outside.
The modern board completely omitted this covenant from the digitization process, Victoria whispered, a sudden sharp current of electricity returning to her baritone voice. Under Washington state heritage laws, an active historic covenant overrides any standard commercial redevelopment permit currently pending approval. She lifted her head, the icy brilliance returning to her eyes with the force of a sudden blinding sunrise. If we can present this original document to the Municipal Preservation Board before the noon eviction deadline, we can trigger an immediate emergency injunction.
Then let's go, I said, a wave of profound, fierce triumph rushing through my chest as I gathered the heavy papers into my canvas tote bag. We turned toward the private elevator, our movements synchronized, a perfect alliance of her systemic brilliance and my stubborn survival instinct. But before Victoria could press the call button, the heavy stainless steel doors of the elevator slid open with a soft, mechanical hiss. The triumphant air in the penthouse evaporated instantly, leaving a cold, suffocating silence that made my blood turn to ice. Marcus stepped out into the pristine living room, flanked by two older men in dark, expensive corporate suits and a city marshal wearing a tactical vest. He looked damp, manic, and completely triumphant, a vicious, predatory grin twisting his lips as his eyes scanned our joined hands. "Going somewhere, ladies?" Marcus sneered, stepping forward with an obnoxious, heavy cadence that instantly violated the clean space. One of the lawyers stepped forward, pulling a crisp, white legal document from his briefcase and holding it out toward Victoria. "Miss Sterling," the lawyer stated in a flat, clinical voice, "by order of the Executive Board and the Sterling Family Trust, your authorization has been revoked." He gestured to the city marshal, who stepped forward, his hand resting casually near the holster of his sidearm. "We are here to enforce an expedited emergency eviction of Unit 3 Bites, due to immediate structural hazard, effective as of 10:45 a.m. My chest tightened so hard I couldn't draw breath. The canvas bag containing our only loophole clutched tightly against my ribs. Marcus took 3 steps toward me, his eyes gleaming with the pathetic, destructive rage of a man who had finally found a way to win. "The game is over, Elena," he whispered, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "You and the kid are out on the street in 15 minutes, and your pretty landlord can't save you this time." Victoria stepped directly between us, her tall frame completely blocking Marcus from my view, her face freezing into the most terrifyingly absolute expression of aristocratic fury I had ever witnessed. "Let me be clear," Victoria whispered, the threat hanging in the air like a loaded weapon. "Let me be clear," Victoria whispered, her voice slicing through the tense room like a scalpel. "You are standing inside my private domicile without a warrant signed by a state Supreme Court judge." The lead lawyer frowned, adjusting his silk tie, but the city marshal instinctively took a half step back, recognizing the absolute authority in her posture. "Miss Sterling, the board has temporary emergency powers regarding structurally compromised properties," the lawyer stated, though his voice lacked its previous confidence. While Victoria held their attention like a flawless shield, I didn't waste a single heartbeat. I slipped backward toward the dark walnut kitchen island, pulling the faded 1912 Covenant from my canvas tote bag. On the counter sat Victoria's private executive terminal, a high-end interface that still maintained a direct, secure line to the municipal legal registry. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as my fingers flew across the sleek touchscreen, scanning the ancient document into the system. "Elena, back away from that terminal," Marcus barked, finally noticing my movement and stepping forward with a raised hand. Before he could cross the room, Victoria intercepted him, her hand catching his wrist in a grip so tight his face twisted in sudden pain. "Touch her, and I will ensure your detention begins before the next minute passes," she hissed, her ice-blue eyes burning with a dangerous, protective fire.
With a final, desperate tap on the glowing glass, I sent the historical document directly to the head of the Seattle Historic Preservation Board. I marked the transmission as a high-priority emergency municipal injunction. For a long, agonizing 10 seconds, the penthouse fell into a suffocating, breathless silence. Then, the lead lawyer's phone began to vibrate violently against his thigh. Simultaneously, the city marshal's tactical radio crackled to life with a loud, static-filled command from the municipal precinct. The lawyer pulled out his device, his eyes widening in pure horror as he read the urgent corporate alert flashing across his screen. The Preservation Board just issued an immediate, absolute freeze on all demolition and eviction permits for the Queen Anne property, the lawyer stammered, his face turning completely bloodless. The Eleanor Sterling Covenant of 1912 has been legally verified. The building is officially recognized as a protected historic sanctuary. The city marshal stepped back entirely, looking at the stunned corporate lawyers with a sharp, displeased frown.
"This eviction order is legally void," the marshal announced, turning his gaze toward Marcus, who was staring in absolute, uncomprehending shock. Victoria slowly released Marcus's wrist, smoothing down the front of her white shirt with a slow, terrifyingly calm precision. "Marshal," Victoria said, her signature baritone voice returning with the full weight of her systemic power. "Now that the corporate theater is concluded, I would like to report a trespasser with active felony warrants for child support evasion and stalking." She gestured coldly toward Marcus, whose frantic, defensive posture crumbled instantly as the marshal stepped forward with a pair of steel handcuffs. "Elena, wait! You can't do this to me!" Marcus screamed as the marshal grabbed his arms, forcing them behind his back with a loud, definitive click. "Get him out of my sight," Victoria commanded, her icy glare tracking him until the elevator doors closed, swallowing his pathetic shouts completely. The corporate lawyers scurried out right behind them, leaving the penthouse suddenly vast, quiet, and completely victorious. I let out a long, shaky breath, the canvas bag slipping from my fingers as my knees threatened to buckle under the sudden, overwhelming relief. Victoria turned around, her armor completely disintegrating as she rushed across the polished concrete floor, catching me in her arms before I could fall. She pulled me tightly against her chest, her face burying into the curls of my hair, her entire body trembling with a profound, unshielded emotion. "We did it," I whispered against her neck, breathing in the rich, comforting scent of her cedarwood perfume. "We saved our home." "You saved it, Elena," Victoria murmured, her voice losing every ounce of its professional distance, replaced by a low, fiercely tender resonance. "You found the foundation, and you chose to fight for it when I had given up on my own rules." 3 weeks passed, bringing a beautiful, crisp winter sunshine that melted the last of the heavy Seattle gray. Victoria had permanently severed her ties with the toxic Sterling family trust, using her independent personal assets to buy the vintage building outright. She was no longer the managing partner of a cold corporation. She was the proud director of the Eleanor Sterling Historic Sanctuary. Down the hall, the quiet, regular hum of Lily's new medical-grade nebulizer faded into the background, completely drowned out by her happy giggles. Lily was currently sitting at the kitchen table painting a massive, bright yellow moon on a fresh canvas, completely unbothered by the world. Victoria sat right next to her on a wooden stool, entirely devoid of her rigid corporate suits. She wore a soft, oversized cream knit sweater that made her look remarkably gentle, her golden bob tucked loosely behind her ears. She held a graphite pencil, her long, manicured fingers perfectly relaxed as she drew a soft, sweeping shadow under Lily's guidance. "You're doing it wrong, Ice Queen," Lily giggled, using the nickname with total affectionate familiarity as she patted Victoria's hand. "You have to let your wrist go loose, remember?" Mommy said art isn't a board meeting. Victoria chuckled, a genuine, rich sound that filled the warm kitchen with a beautiful, light energy I had never heard before. "Let me be clear, little bug," Victoria murmured, her ice-blue eyes softening into a deep, warm ocean as she looked down at the child.
I am trying my absolute best to follow your instructions, but precision is a hard habit to break. I stood by the counter, pouring fresh cinnamon tea into 2 heavy ceramic mugs, my heart overflowing with a profound, unshakable peace. I walked over to the table, setting the mugs down, and stood directly behind Victoria, resting my hands gently on her soft shoulders. Victoria immediately leaned back against my touch, her head tilting up to look at me. The icy blue of her eyes completely melted into pure, unshielded devotion. "The rent is officially $0 a month, Ms. Vance," Victoria whispered, a rare, breathtaking smile spreading across her elegant lips. "But I believe the new lease addendum requires a lifetime of private tutoring from the illustrator on the third floor." I leaned down, pressing a warm, lingering kiss against the soft line of her jaw, my lips brushing the skin that used to be hidden behind iron walls. "That's a very strict contract, Miss Sterling," I murmured back, my fingers sliding up to gently tangle in her golden hair. "I intend to enforce every single clause," she whispered, her hand rising to cover mine, her palm warm, open, and completely ours. Outside, the city of Seattle buzzed with life, but inside our castle, the structure was finally perfect, built on a foundation that could never be broken. The Ice Queen finally melted, and our temporary contract turned into a promise for a lifetime. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. See you in the next one.